Ladies and gentlemen, good day. My name is LJ Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. I'm delighted today to have with us Dr. J. Stephen Morrison. He is the Senior Vice President and Director of the CSIS Global Health Policy Center. Welcome, Dr. Morrison.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. As you know, as the community's premier global education, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, the World Affairs Council has always strived to bring the world closer to you and to build a community of internationally informed and engaged citizens. Dialogue, knowledge, active participation, and an understanding of global issues are vitally important for our democracy to flourish at all levels. Now, a bit of housekeeping. Please note that your microphone will be on mute and your camera turned off for the duration of the presentation. To submit a question at any time, please use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar, and you can see it here on the screen. Do not use the chat. Please use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar. This presentation will be recorded and sent out via the World Affairs Council mailing list. So please make sure you're signed up to receive our emails. If you enjoy this free program, consider making a tax-deductible donation to help support our international education mission. And please do know that membership in the World Affairs Council is a crucial contribution to us in these difficult times. And if you're not a member, please consider becoming a member. And we appreciate those of you that are already World Affairs Council members. I would like to use this opportunity to also welcome our board members, the World Affairs Council board members that are leading us, and thank you all for participating. We will have a World Affairs Council board member, Dr. Derek Raghavan, conduct and lead the question and answer session of this program. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan, for doing this. Let me now introduce to you Dr. J. Stephen Morrison. As I said, he's a Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and Director of its Global Health Policy Center. Dr. Morrison writes widely, has directed several high-level commissions, and is a frequent commentator on U.S. foreign policy, global health, Africa, and foreign assistance. He served in the Clinton administration as committee staff in the House of Representatives and taught for 12 years at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin and is a magna cum laude graduate of Yale College. Let me just add that today the topic we have is of immediate and pressing importance and significance. What happens with the vaccine will affect not only our everyday lives, but our ability to travel, to work, our economy, our schools, our whole community. We have heard news about the AstraZeneca and Oxford vaccine being delayed for a little bit. I'm sure we'll hear about that from Dr. Stephen Morrison. But thank you for being here today and talking to us about what is happening with the COVID-19 virus vaccine development and generally with COVID-19. Dr. J. Stephen Morrison.
Thank you so much, LJ Stambuk, and thank you to Derek Raghavan for so kindly agreeing to serve in the discussion portion. I'm going to try and keep my comments to 30 minutes maximum, perhaps shorter, and leave plenty of time to hear from you all. This is a topic that goes in multiple directions, and there's many things that we can talk about. I'll be trying to hit on some top-line events, both about the virus, about our response to the virus, about some of the international dimensions, but also around the vaccines. We've been doing lots of work over the last 9 months on all of those topics, and I'll offer some quick remarks. First of all, where are we today in the global outbreak, and where does the U.S. sit? We're at about 27.7 million cases. The U.S. share of that, 6.4 million cases. Roughly a quarter of the world's cases. We have 4% of the world's population. 900,000 plus deaths, US share 190,000. We're likely to hit by November 3rd, somewhere in the order of about 220,000 on the elections. We'll see where we are as we hit the end of year, how close to 300,000 we get. We are now running at 40,000 cases per day on average, on the weekly averages, 40,000 new cases per day, 800 to 1,000 deaths per day. Those numbers were much higher in July, but they were much lower in May. In other words, we had a lockdown in varying forms across the country from mid to late March, extending into April, sometimes into May and June, depending on where you were. As we got to the end of that period, we were down to approximately 20,000 cases per day. Then there was reopening, some of those reopenings premature. Some of the lockdowns were not sufficient in terms of coverage and the like, and we had a very rapid rebound. Mid-July, we had 75,000 cases a day, which set a global record, just broken recently, yesterday, by the Indians, who had 90,000. But now the level has been brought down to 40 from a 60,000 plus over the course of July, which is progress, but we're still at a very, very dramatic level at 40,000 per day and 800 to 1,000 deaths. We're at the end of the first 9-month period. We're entering the fall. We're entering a season in which it will become colder. There will be more respiratory flu and the like. Flu will recur. We'll be in more confined spaces. And so there's a expectation and an anxiety that we're heading into a period where things could get more difficult again in the United States, worse than perhaps what we've seen so far. But let me just say a few things, like, where do we stand as a country in the way that we understand and think about this? And I want to cite a poll that just came out today by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is a very reputable, nonpartisan, objective polling operation, very high quality. They just came out with a poll today, and what does it show us? It shows that the public's trust in the CDC and top US doctors such as Anthony Fauci and others is rapidly dropping, and particularly among Republicans. It's showing that a very high proportion of Americans still have very incorrect beliefs about the pandemic, about the efficacy of things like hydroxychloroquine, about whether there's a cure. Interestingly, less than half of Americans that were surveyed would want to get vaccinated against COVID-19 if, in fact, there was a vaccine made available in early November or sometime after that. So what we're seeing here is the great distrust among both Republicans and Democrats, but it breaks down in a few different ways. Republican confidence in the CDC has dropped by 30 points since April. The favorability figures for Tony Fauci have dropped by 30 points as well. So Republican distrust and negatives and a lack of confidence in CDC and Fauci has really soured. The public still has a higher opinion of Fauci than Republicans at large, and Democrats have higher. Interestingly, of those surveyed, just 40% of those who were surveyed said they trust President Trump to provide reliable information about the pandemic. What I take that to mean is that the president's base of support is standing with him and listening to what he says, and the rest of the population is not taking it seriously. Interestingly, of the proportion that says, of those who said, would you want to get vaccinated if a vaccine was approved and offered for free before the November election? Only 40%. But interestingly, 60% of Republicans said they would not want to get the vaccine. Higher numbers than the Democrats. And I think that's kind of curious and telling, but it just shows us how divided we are. And when you saw the two conventions And we can talk a little bit more about how they lined up. But the two conventions, it was really different. I mean, the Democratic Convention was really talking about COVID and race, racial justice, but centering on this is the premier crisis we face. With the Republicans, it was it was very much different. It's about the economy, it's about violence and racial strife. So I was very moved in reading this report. It wasn't that surprising, but it is kind of stark. So let me say a few things about health security as a field and a little bit about what we've learned in the last 6 months. Now, health security as a field. We have a commission at CSIS we've been running for 2 years. CSIS Commission on Strengthening America's Health Security. We have former Senator Kelly Ayotte, former CDC Director Julie Gerberding co-chairing it. We've got six members of Congress split between Democrats, Republicans, House, Senate, and a whole array of very diverse opinion leaders who've worked with us. And we pulled this together because we felt like there has been progress in health security, in preparing countries, ourselves and other countries, to deal with these unexpected pathogens. The Ebola experience taught us much. The earlier SARS crisis, some of the earlier pandemic flu crises, there had been some significant improvements. We can talk about that. But we felt like as a field, health security is very problematic. And it's prone to what we described as a cycle of crisis and complacencies. That is, investing in the basic capacities of being able to detect, respond, and prevent these outbreaks. It's something that we scramble to do in the midst of crisis, which is not the best time to try and be building a fire department. And we pour a lot of money against the problem, and people get mobilized, but then time passes, and we settle into a process of complacency and neglect, and we underinvest and we move on. And why is this field so vulnerable to that problem? Partly it's a hidden field. It's people out doing things that aren't particularly visible in building up these kind of basic public health capacities. And if they're successful, bad things don't happen. And so they don't happen, but you don't know that they don't happen necessarily. So it's a quiet and somewhat less visible kind of enterprise. It's separate oftentimes, and for bad reasons, I think, often separate from the medical field and health services. It's public health departments around the country. We have 3,000 jurisdictions around the country. They're underfinanced, they're understaffed, and oftentimes they're not very closely integrated with our health system. I mean, we spend a minuscule sum on health preparedness as against what we provide in terms of care per person in our health system. It's in terms of what agencies and what parts of our government work on this. Within the federal government, scattered across multiple agencies, it requires a lot of coordination. It's partly split between those who are operating against things that occur naturally, that is pandemics, new pathogens that arrive that are dangerous that we've never seen before, like the coronavirus. Some of it is also against nefarious actors, state or non-state, that are making bioweapons, which is an important field. So the field has these two big dimensions to it. It's not a field that competes very well against other things that are more visible. If you have scarce dollars and you're competing against road building or school building or health service expansion, health clinics, you're going to lose unless there's really a pressing need to this. And what we saw was, of course, that over the last decades, governments put forward policies, including the Trump administration, around health security, biodefense. They paid lip service to this is a national security priority. It must be part of our national security, but the translation into budgets and commitments and high-level political engagement was not there. We came out in November of last year, 6 weeks before the coronavirus was disclosed by the Chinese to the WHO. on December 31st. In mid-November, we came out with a report of a year and a half of work of this commission. What were the major conclusions? Restore White House leadership. White House leadership on this matter at the National Security Council had been disbanded with no explanation. That needs to be restored. We need a central authoritative group that can hold all of the different agencies to account, be at the elbow of the president, be able to coordinate, oversee, and drive a vision forward. That's been missing. We need to restore that. We were making that claim before we've gone through all of the COVID experiences. We need new and flexible types of funding. We need an investment in our domestic capacities, an investment in building capacities abroad in countries that have very weak capacities, and which, if they are not equipped, are going to export these pathogens to us, and they're going to be responding very late, which was the lesson we saw with Ebola. We need to be able to respond very rapidly with contingency funds and the like. We need to be focusing on vaccines and therapies and getting aggressive and forward-looking at building platforms to shorten the time that we can get to therapies and vaccines and diagnostics. And we have to focus on a new dimension, which is being called the infodemic, which is that we're now 20 years into having social media, and we're 20 years into seeing weaponized social media and systematic disinformation and misinformation that has led to a regression already. And we spent much of our time in our piece talking about the regression, the return of measles in the United States and globally, which is directly attributable to this problem. Well, we face that problem here today. So let me turn now back to, okay, what have we learned in these 9 months of this pandemic? First of all, it's a remarkably pernicious virus, and it remains a remarkably pernicious and challenging virus, one that Tony Fauci has described as his worst nightmare. It's an upper respiratory disease. It is easily and rapidly transmitted. It takes a month from exposure, infection, becoming symptomatic, getting diagnosed, and action taken. There's a delaying factor. There's a lack of visibility. It is 25 to 40% of transmission is by people who are asymptomatic and who are likely unknowing that they are carrying this virus and transmitting it. So it has that remarkably pernicious and challenging reality. It is a novel virus. It's new. It is a coronavirus. It's like the other common cold coronaviruses. There are 4 that's circulating the world. It's going to keep moving. It's going to move fast. We have no immunity to this. We have no prior scientific knowledge of it. We have no vaccine yet. We should have some soon, I hope. We have only a few limited therapies, but this arrived with no preset diagnostic, no preset therapies, and certainly no vaccine. We are still trying to address some of the big questions around scientific uncertainties. If you get sick, do you acquire immunity? For how long? You may get a big dose, you may get a less than a big dose, and how is all of that tied together? If you get infected, if you get infected and you recover, can you be reinfected? What is the science and the risk on children? I think we early on lapsed into a false dichotomy in thinking that it was really older people, those with underlying conditions, who were the most vulnerable, and children. Well, we don't need to worry that much. Well, there are 500,000 children in America that have been infected, and many of them have suffered pretty grievously, and we're still trying to figure that out. And I don't think we have the science on children quite yet. This virus, and getting back to the perniciousness of it, obviously it attacks your lungs. And there's a large body of those 6.4 million Americans that have been infected that we know of, and there's probably many, many more millions who have had this not unknowingly or undiagnosed. There's a long train of people that are long haulers, being called long haulers, people who are living with the aftermath and the uncertainty of the aftermath, and discovering that this can do very lasting damage to lungs, but it also attacks your vascular system, your lungs. I mentioned lungs, kidney, brain. It throws off clots. It can cause strokes and seizures. That's an alarming and complicated set of things that we're just, as a medical community, beginning to get our arms around this. We don't know what herd immunity means, i.e., when you look at this and you think, how are we going to get out from underneath this? People say, well, either through vaccine or through people getting sick and acquiring immunity. We'll reach some level at which the world's population, the Americans' population, is acquiring herd immunity, and then we can return to some normality. We don't know what that is. Is it 40%? Is it 70%? And how long does it last? If it's being achieved through vaccines, how many vaccines and how often? These are things we're still trying to deal with. We do know that, this coronavirus is sweeping the world. It's moving. It's limited seasonality upon its impact. There was a hope early on that like SARS, that perhaps when it becomes hot and humid, we'd see some diminution. We didn't see much of that. We do know that it's had, while its impacts differ dramatically across countries, it has one common impact that we're seeing, which is in the absence of vaccine, in the absence of cure, in the absence of therapies that can dramatically lower mortality, we really have to turn to behavioral practices. We have to move towards what have been called lockdowns or something short of lockdowns, but we have to deal with behavioral changes in which businesses and other things, schools, businesses, other congregational settings are closed, economies are disrupted, social distancing, mask use, other protections are put in place. This has been an experiment globally in that regard, and it has led to multiple discoveries. It's been difficult, I think, for everybody to understand. There's been some greater success than the United States has seen in many countries, but everything remains pretty fragile, and we're seeing rebounds. In terms of what have we discovered in this period, we need to think long-term, not short-term. In other words, this is not a 6-month problem that's going to be put to bed quickly, and we're going to go back to whatever normal becomes in this next phase. This is something where we need to be thinking in 2-year increments and beyond in getting to the resolution. The WHO outside, we saw WHO overwhelmed, shoved to the side. We can talk about the fact that WHO is a weak institution. It does not have inspection authority. It's a member states organization. It has to be highly deferential to all member states. It gets caught in this escalating confrontation between the United States and China. We sever our relationship with WHO. This gets to be very, very difficult. What else have we learned? I mentioned that the false dichotomy between young and old. I think the false dichotomy between you're either open for business or you're trying to save lives with public health, versus seeing it as we need to get control over this pandemic. We need to institute public health controls in a smart way while minimizing the economic pain and dislocations by taking the measures that are going to provide the social net and relief and avoid desperation, and try to bring our economies back through control over this. In the case of the United States, we bought ourselves time during our lockdown, which was at about half the level of what we really needed, and many places opened a little prematurely as against the guidelines. That has led to difficulties now, obviously, in seeing what has happened next. I don't think it's not a cold and fast dichotomy between lockdown versus being totally open. It has to be more carefully thought out. We've had some gains on treatment and some gains on therapy, remdesivir, dexamethasone, but those are applied for the most part, and we can hear from Derek on this. Those have applications for those that are the sickest. We've had some false starts, the hydroxychloroquine, of which in this most recent survey that I mentioned from Kaiser, shows a very high number, almost half population still believing that this has some impact on as a therapy when it doesn't. Convalescent plasma, we've had another false start there. There are over 200 therapies that are in development or being tested at the moment. Countries, I think, as a pandemic, we're in a pandemic like this, countries are naturally, universally self-absorbed. They face a crisis within their own society that is both health, economics, and social instability. It's a colossal test and colossal stress. We have not seen the level of high diplomacy that you might expect or coordination. It's become very much a nationalistic kind of experience. We have seen in the United States and elsewhere, this virus exploits disparities, inequities, and vulnerabilities. Whether you're elderly, in our country, people of color, poor, those living with underlying conditions, and we have a very large proportion of our population living with underlying conditions. We've seen that markets are really fragile. When you need urgently things like protective gear, ventilators, oxygen, testing kits, reagents, and all of those things. Our federal government, as of mid-April, sort of turned responsibility on the marketplace over to the states and municipalities to manage that. And it became a bit of a free-for-all. And we discovered that markets were highly fragile. Our stockpiles were insufficient. That was a tough lesson. And I think that's something we didn't really anticipate or think much about. We do know that disinformation and communications and lack of public trust is a critical issue. If we soon get to a vaccine or vaccines, we're going to have to face this issue and face it sooner rather than later in trying to convey to an anxious public that is worried about the politicization of the vaccines, that are worried that things are being rushed too quickly, that politics is trumping science and safety. We're going to have to be able to bring forward, and there's been a lot of discussion of this in Congress by our public health officials and others. I'm not going to go over all of the variations that have happened across the world. We can talk about how do we explain the exceptional US outcome, and I think it largely comes down to three big, large baskets of issues: leadership, our own political divisions and culture, and also our systemic weaknesses in our public health system. I want to say a few words about the vaccine, and then I'm going to close. There is a scramble underway for a vaccine. Obviously, so much hangs on getting a safe and effective vaccine or set of vaccines quickly as possible as a way of trying to get out from underneath the burden, the health, the economic, social instability burdens that we face. There's very good reason to be hopeful here. There are 7 candidates that are in phase 3 trials, phase 3 human trials. The last large-scale human trials, there are 3 in the United States, 3 of the cases. AstraZeneca was referenced, that's one of the 3. If you get to this stage of phase 3 trials, you've been through 2 earlier field trials, as you get to phase 3, your probability of success rises dramatically. And there are now in the world 7 candidates in phase 3 trials, phase 3 human trials, 3 of them supported by the United States and 4 outside of the United States. And they're a diverse set of different vaccine models. They're not all the same type of vaccines. I won't go into all the technicalities, but having a diversity, having some that are the more familiar ones that have been used in recent decades and some that are brand new types of technology, it's a good mix. It's a good mix. There's a total of 30 that are in clinical development right now, 30 vaccines, and I expect in the next year we will see another 30 added to that. The US government has launched US Operation Warp Speed, put $10 billion under this, brought in General Perna from the Army Material Command to direct this effort. So it's both, and brought in Monsef Salawi from GSK, a very distinguished and highly regarded vaccine scientist from GSK, who has come in to be the chief medical scientist, has $10 billion. It has the ability to bring in HHS, DOD, other agencies in around this, and it's working closely with its industry partners. That funding is funding that says to those get through the field trials, but even before you get to the end of the field trials, start manufacturing today, so that when we know whether what you're developing is safe and effective, we have stockpiles already in place to begin distribution. We're not going to do the normal wait until that point, then begin building factories and producing stuff. So it's a very expensive process, but we've got $10 billion against 6 bets, and it's moving ahead very, very quickly. Now, globally, the wealthiest countries of the world have locked up 4 billion doses, 4 billion future doses in these schemes. The Europeans are doing the same thing. Some of the other wealthy countries of the world are doing the same thing. It does raise the question of, if we're successful, will the wealthy countries of the world be served and the rest of the world is going to be left for a very long lag time with high uncertainty? And what will that mean? Because we know we need a global solution to this. We can't have a partial solution. We can't just vaccinate wealthy countries and think that that's going to solve what is a global problem. We'll just continue to have regeneration and reintroduction. We know the US-China strategic clash is terribly important now. Russia and China have both announced that they have candidates that they have approved for human use now before going through the field trials. That's very controversial and to be watched carefully. The AstraZeneca case, where we had an adverse event among one patient in Britain in a field trial, all of their field trials halted for the moment while they investigate that. There are 80 field trials in the United States underway for that one vaccine. We do have huge complexities if we get to the to a point later this year or early next year in which we do have safe and effective vaccine or vaccines, and the production has moved forward. We have still very complicated challenges in terms of how do we decide populations that will be prioritized and in what phasing. And we have very complicated logistical issues around how will those vaccines be moved from stockpile warehouse to the individual, and how does that happen? And those details are all being debated and worked out now. And how will we deal with refusal and hesitation? How will we deal with a population that we know today is highly skeptical, a large portion, saying they will refuse or they're going to wait? And we're going to need to deal with that as a human engagement, as a communications engagement. I'm going to stop right there and turn the floor back to Dr. Derek Robin. Thank you.
So thank you, Stephen. That was authoritative and stimulating, and we're starting to get a lot of questions. And what I'm going to try to do is bracket the questions to make it a little easier. I should preface my comments by saying the WACC has to be nonpartisan, and so those of you who have a partisan view, if you could tone down the questions, it'll make it easier for an old man like me to get them into the program. So, one question that we'd like to start with, if you think about all the countries of the world having the same population as the USA, so our population in the USA is 330 million. So if you imagine that, say, Taiwan had a population of 330 million, instead of having somewhere between 180,000 and 200,000 deaths, they would have had about 100 deaths. For New Zealand, it would have been about 1,500. For Australia, about 3,600. Even our friends to the north, our Canadian colleagues, if they had a population of 330 million, they would have had less than 80,000 deaths by now. So why do you think that is? So CSIS is internationally renowned as a think tank, a strategy center. Often the strategists like to pose the questions, but let me nail you down and say, okay, so countries that are pretty similar to the USA have had so much dramatically less death from coronavirus. Can you sort of think through why you think that might be? And in so doing, perhaps give us a list of bullet points that you would say, as of today, I, Stephen Morrison, think America should do the following to get us through this in a safe fashion.
Yes, that's a great question. Dr. Rockhaven. I would begin by saying certain countries have been standouts in their performance, and you've named some of them: Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand. And I think let's treat China as a separate entity. I mean, China had obviously the onset of this and did something that was unprecedented in human history, which was to put 150 million people under a complete lockdown for 70 days, and upwards of half of its population, 700 million people, under some form of controlled lockdown for 70 days. And it succeeded. And it was brutal, and it was not very kind, and it was not very transparent, et cetera, et cetera. But from a disease control, and we're not sure that it's transparent. You know, we know there are outbreaks that are probably not getting reported. And we know that there was suppression of media coverage, suppression of any counter dissent to this. So let's set China apart, because the turnaround in China requires its own explanation. But for those cases that remain countries that are democratic to varying degrees, what is it about them that allowed them to have such sterling outcomes? And I would include in there South Korea. I don't think I mentioned South Korea. Those countries, they're not all Asian. I mean, New Zealand is Asian, but what do they have that accounts for their success? Well, to varying degrees, they all had a searing historical experience up close and personal with SARS and with pandemic flus 20 years ago. And they took away from those experiences never again. And they just made decisions, they made strategic decisions at that point that they were going to build up public health preparedness capacities, which would have the ability to test universally, very rapidly, be able to isolate and contain those who are sick, and do contact tracing to chase down and control. They were going to have controls over their borders. If people are coming back in, they were going to have quarantining facilities. They were going to be doing a number of things in that way. And they created, through their legislatures, through their executive actions, they created the authorities and the funding structures to do this so that it was seen as respectful of democratic rights. It was something that enjoyed broad popular support around this is the individual. There was not a big debate going on in most of these countries about individual liberties and freedoms versus protections of the community by this kind of system. You had political culture come into this. You had the searing experience. You had the historical experience. You had the scale of the societies. I mean, New Zealand is a small island country, controlling its borders and getting consent from within its populations. It also had, all of these places had very strong leadership at the top and sustained over time. And that leadership understood that this had to be a priority. And so what I described earlier about the cycle of crisis and complacency was broken in those countries. They got beyond that, and they were able to fund these programs, train them, and move them. And when you look at what happened in South Korea or in Taiwan, it's astonishing. And we've spent a lot of time looking at those cases and looking at New Zealand and Hong Kong. They're not invulnerable to continued outbreaks by any means. And there are debates that are going on now about, is there use of digital technology? Is there use of technology to monitor behavior crossing the line into abrogating people's civil liberties? And that's a big debate. So it's not without its flaws and not without its setbacks and not without civil liberty issues and the like. But I think that captures pretty well. And I would put Australia. Australia is interesting, though, because Australia has a very strong public health system. It has a small population, 25 million people. It has a strong record and a pride in its public health system. They did reasonably well, and they've had huge setbacks in Melbourne, and they've had to return to complete lockdown in the last 6 weeks, last month in Melbourne. What was that all about? Well, they had a gap in there when they reopened their immigration. When they reopened the immigration provisions, and those are very tight and dramatically managed. We don't manage what happens at the borders with nearly the same tightness. But we're a country, as you say, a country of 330 million people. We're a huge country. We're a complex place. We also do not have a national unity around our health system. We have a very divided set of opinions. We have a weak public health system, and we do not have a united consensus around what needs to happen. Every step of the way, in this last 9 months, we've seen how politicized these issues become around some of the basic elements of mask wearing and social distancing and lockdowns and sacrifice. And we haven't fixed the testing problem. We started this without a national testing system. We didn't use the time that we had to create those basic capacities. So we are different in a fundamental way from that, and we're paying a huge price, and we're going to have to figure out how to recover from that. And it has, I think, greatly alarmed the world to see what has happened. You know, there was an estimation done by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, did a global study of all countries and graded them in great detail as to their preparedness against these kind of outbreaks. And the United States was #1. It was the best equipped country in the world for fending off. But what we did not see were the weaknesses, systemic weaknesses, the problems of leadership, and the divisions within our own society.
You know, our public health system is disappointing, as you've said. Another great example is maternal mortality. You would expect we have the lowest maternal mortality in the world, and we're actually in the lower half internationally. So, you know, the interesting microcosm is if you compare the states in this area, North Carolina versus South Carolina versus Georgia, the death rate from coronavirus in South Carolina and Georgia is double that in North Carolina. And the nature of leadership here and the cooperation of the population in public health rules has been quite different. And it's an interesting model system for us to follow. So a number of other questions have come up. A very provocative one was there is some evidence, the questioner says, that booster doses of vaccines unrelated to COVID may actually turn on immunity and might be helpful. From your vantage point, do you think there are data to support the thought that maybe doing non-specific vaccination boosters like for TB or other things that would turn on the lymphocyte or defense system, is that a potential solution that should be explored?
I think all solutions need to be explored. That particular question is beyond my expertise to answer, so I'm going to punt on that one. I do, and that may be a very valid and promising pathway that your questioners put forward. I'll just comment. It
wasn't meant to be a hardball question. I think it's a provocative idea. I think the honest truth is we don't know. It's not a strategy that has been explored to this point. And then a follow-on question was, you know, you mentioned the Kaiser Foundation analysis that shows reducing trust in the CDC, the FDA, and Anthony Fauci. And, you know, do you think that's well placed? You know, I think my personal view, apolitically, is the FDA and the CDC have actually dropped the ball. They've allowed political pressure from either side to influence what they've done. I think, on the other hand, maybe Anthony Fauci is a victim of people just getting sick and tired of COVID. It's been here a long time, and just identifying him as one of the people associated with COVID, therefore less popular. So do you think there's a basis for this? Is it just COVID fatigue? Do you think it has to do with the way the public agencies are doing their work?
I think there's certainly a lot of fatigue that is observed in our population that is leading to frustration and more cynicism. I think that the incoherence and contradictions coming from the federal level, from the White House, have and the direct assaults and the direct attacks upon FDA, upon CDC, upon the leadership, the singling out of Fauci, of Deborah Birx, of Robert Redfield, of Francis Collins, and then that gets picked up and amplified within the media ecosphere, has had its impact. It's had the impact, and you've seen that it's differential in that Kaiser thing. More Republicans embrace that sort of discrediting of these institutions than Democrats, but I think CDC suffered a deflation and FDA suffered a deflation of reputation and standing. I mean, if you look at FDA, the actions taken by the leadership in capitulating in mid-March on giving the emergency use authorization on hydroxychloroquine when that was not warranted, and then reversing course later in June, that was damaging. Then to be coerced in the weekend before the beginning of the Republican National Convention, to come forward on that Sunday evening. I mean, you recall the president had a Twitter storm on that Saturday evening saying that the FDA was a deep state engaged in some conspiracy to slow down stuff, and that there would be a great announcement the next day. The next day at 6 p.m. was the president, Steve Hahn, head of FDA, and Alex Azar, Secretary of HHS. And Steve Hahn claimed 35% gains in mortality with the convalescent plasma, which was just an outrageous misrepresentation of fact. And he was widely condemned for that and had to try and walk it back, and then was condemned in turn from the White House for walking it back. So they have been caught in these impossible situations. And the same, you could recount similar things with CDC. I mean, the debacle around testing that occurred in the early days when CDC, which is the gold standard in developing tests, had a bad set of experiences in putting its tests together, and lost key time and fumbled the ball. FDA also fumbled on the authorizations in that pitch, and so we wound up in this absolutely impossible situation in the spring where our testing was just nowhere when we needed testing all everywhere. And how and why did that happen? And we're still struggling with that legacy. So I think CDC suffered quite a bit of damage in that regard. I think also CDC's come under assault because it's being muzzled, frankly, from being its typical role. Its standard role is by issuing guidance and facts and doing daily briefings. It's been stopped from doing that. It's lost control over guidance, and it no longer controls the flow of data coming from hospitals. That is now diverted through a contractor to HHS. So it's been marginalized, it's been stigmatized and denigrated, and its leadership has been subject to these things. And it's going to take a long time. I mean, the damage to our institutions, I think what you were suggesting, some of this is inflicted by leadership choices in those institutions. There you get into a debate of, what's right? Do you resign? At what point do you resign? At what point do you say enough is enough? I can't do this anymore. And I think many people have looked at this situation, this drama unfolding, and said, well, Tony Fauci and Robert Redfield and Stephen Hahn, and these people they may be making mistakes, but they're serving our country and they're doing it in good faith, and they're paying a price personally. Their health and their reputations are at risk, but they're dedicated, and we need them to stay dedicated, because if they leave, who do we get next? So it is a dilemma. It's a very difficult one, and I think we have to be careful not to be too judgmental, frankly, about the choices that they've made, and give them in some fashion the benefit of the doubt in terms of acting in good faith and honorable ways under exceedingly difficult circumstances.
I've worked with Steve Hahn for decades, and he's a very rational, very science-driven guy. So the pressure that he is under must be extraordinary. Bunch of questions, Stephen, that are focused on, so now what? Let's imagine that the 7 pharma CEOs are actually telling the truth, which would be pretty unique, but let's pretend for a minute that they're telling the truth and they're not going to rush to market. And they actually do the meticulous studies and say, okay, we have, say, 2 vaccines that have passed level 1 evidence. In other words, they've gone through randomized trials. The people who get those vaccines are getting less coronavirus, etc. A couple of questions have come up that says, so once you get to there, how does Joe Average approach this? You know, the old measles vaccine story and the various other vaccines where people worry about neurological side effects and the various other toxicities of vaccines, that has been in the background of, you know, from the get-go. So from the CSIS point of view, do you have any data that have come in to suggest that if the nation is presented with a vaccine that in the short term works, will people accept it? The implication from the Kaiser Foundation thing is a lot of people might not. The whole area has been politicized. Taking a step up to a higher level, do you see the potential for an immediately safe coronavirus vaccine taking off in the USA and people trying it? Or do you think there'll be even more hesitation than getting kids vaccinated for measles and various other things?
Well, there's many different questions there. Let me try and parse out a few answers. I think a likely scenario is that of those bets that the U.S. has made and the bets that have been made by others, they will be conducted, I think, the 6 primary partners that we have under the Operation Warp Speed. I think those CEOs are determined to play by the rules and not cut corners. And it's clear why. They know that public already distrusts this, and they cannot afford to sacrifice their long-term reputations and within American society in order to satisfy a short-term political imperative in which they might put people's lives and health at risk. So I think there's going to be enormous rigor and discipline and caution in moving ahead. And that has been echoed from multiple directions in the last 2 weeks. And I think that's a good thing. I think industry is helping us do the right thing here. I think that we will probably see some promising results that permit the FDA to credibly issue an emergency use authorization for limited use of the vaccine or vaccines for select populations in the next 6 months that would be targeted to the healthcare providers, health workers, elderly, those with underlying conditions. And perhaps there's added in some other categories, you know, people who are defending critical infrastructure, or people who are working in grocery lines, or people who are providing other essential services. How the lines are drawn and how the population's comprised. But it's going to start on that level while the trials carry forward at least another 6 months to get a fuller picture of what the science tells us. The trials are going to go on for 4 to 5 years. The question is, how much risk do you assume at what stage? And I think that there will be I think enough evidence will come forward and people say, okay, it's still not, it's got to be above 50% efficacy according to FDA. And it's got to be enough numbers, right? They have to have the numbers of people who've gotten sick and can show this in a double-blind trial. And they have to get those numbers. And if they don't have those numbers, they can't come forward with this. And I think that will, so it will happen, it will unfold in modest increments. There will be a debate around what is that first, what populations are in that first pool of people. I think that's easier to define, and I think it's easier to reach those people that are going to be working in health facilities, people who are elderly, people who have chronic diseases. I think reaching those folks. And I think you will also begin to compensate for the racial biases in disparities, because you'll be reaching many of those people who are in those services or who have those conditions and the like. And then we're going to go to something later in 2021 when we feel more confident and the terms are enlarged, and then we're going to be moving into a larger population. But it's not, I don't think that it's going to be overnight. I think your question around how do you address the hesitancy and the doubt and the distrust in the population, we've not seen yet what the strategy of engagement is going to be. We know that in the recruitment for the field trials, we have 6 candidates. Each one needs 30,000 people in field trial. It's 180,000 people. They have to be out there and across hundreds of sites trying to get people that are of color and people who are poor and people who are older, et cetera, et cetera. They're having great difficulty recruiting people into those trials. And that will give them some insight into how to reach people on building trust. And we know that we've expanded testing. We know we have various ways in which providers and others touch their populations. We haven't seen the strategy yet. We're told that the Trump administration has a strategy, a communication strategy. I think there will be a communication strategy. I also don't know how people's personal calculations are going to change. I think people are not fixed in their opinions. People are expressing today their fear and their anxiety because they see this getting politicized. If it's managed well and the product that comes forward looks safe and it does well in its early phase, and people are looking at this and thinking, you know, this is going to be an elemental step in getting me and my family back to work, back to school, out of the risk of getting sick, and being able to do all of those things that have been denied us by this. And I think the calculation will change. I don't know. What do you think, Derek?
You know, I think the big problem at the moment is that the bar has been set very low for political reasons. So, you know, when you talk about a vaccine that has a better than 50% chance of working, that's nothing like measles or mumps or any of the vaccines we use. So you might as well toss a coin and say, am I safe or am I not? Call it 50% and slightly more. Right. So people are smart and they're educated and they're looking at that and saying, why would I take a vaccine with such a low threshold of activity? Right. And so I think you made a very important point early, and many others as well. We've lost trust in leadership and in our scientific bases for a bunch of different reasons. And so that opens us up to chaos. And several of the questions, which I want to bracket as perhaps a final question, what can people do to help themselves? They're the no-brainer things, masking, social distancing, and that goes a little bit against the grain in the USA, but it is what it is. That's, I think, one of the big differences between Australia and New Zealand and the East Asian countries is they've been more disciplined and they don't link masking and distancing with impingement on their rights. But a lot of the questions are saying, well, what can we do? They've given examples of people who take walks in the woods, people who go to isolated beaches. I understand you're not a physician, but what's coming through CSIS is anything promising that people might do other than distancing and masking that might influence outcome? Anything that's on your horizon?
I mean, that might influence their own health status or the broader and the broader?
As it relates to coronavirus, is there anything that you've heard of that has a good database that says, yeah, you know, people can, apart from masking and distancing, anything else you've heard of in terms of lifestyle things that might impact this?
Well, we do know that we're suffering an epidemic of mental health disorder now. We're suffering depression and anxiety disorders are very, very high. And that includes young people. And I think we need to not treat that as a stigmatized phenomenon, but to see that as something that is very real and needs to be treated with compassion and with expertise, and that people need to be acknowledged when this is happening, that there is quick and effective action in that regard. And I'm seeing that among my peers, among my younger people that I interact with, as well as older people. I mean, I spent a good deal of this week trying to find counselors for people who are suffering from depression. And it seems that has awakened as a more visible phenomenon in the last month. I don't know what you're observing. I don't know what any of the people that are assembled are observing, but I do think we need to be very attentive to this. We're heading into winter. It's going to be dark. People are going to be indoors. People are going to feel they're not going to have the joy that you get in the summertime in the same way. Obviously, exercising, getting outdoors every day safely, getting into the sunshine and not eating too much, not drinking. Diet becomes very important. The familial bonds become very important in this period. So that anybody that is isolated is at high risk, I think. If you're living alone, if you're not able to communicate, people that are in that, but would have been very happy because they were getting up and going to work and interacting in their communities, in their churches, or in wherever they had congregational lives. They've been denied that now for 9 months. And that's a big burden. And I think we need to think about that. And that's where I think we need to pay more attention today as we try to take care of ourselves.
Dr. Morrison, Dr.
It may be, Stephen, that
it's 3 o'clock. Do we have more time, Dr. Morrison and Dr. Raghavan? If you have time to go on for another 5 minutes, welcome to Raj Bharadwaj, our board member, who's going to close the event. Would it be possible to extend it for another 5 minutes?
That's fine with me.
Yep.
That's fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you all then. And let me use this opportunity to personally thank you, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Raghavan, and Raj for being with us here today. Go on, please.
So, the interesting odd thing, Stephen, is that it may be that a hidden benefit will turn out to be that mental disease that is associated with this may open things up for people with psychiatric disorders. That's been poorly managed nationally. It's almost like they have to be low-key about it because people are embarrassed about mental disease. And now people are looking at depression and related disorders as being caused by coronavirus and are actually talking a little more freely about it. So it may actually help us get to a better place. One of the questions that has come in that I think you've touched on, but we might just extend a little bit. Between the Republicans and the Democrats, as you said, there's been kind of a push-pull about health versus the economy. And there are nations that have managed to socially distance and mask without closing down the shop. And I just wondered the person just wondered from CSIS's viewpoint, can you give some guidelines in terms of how do we go forward? How do we not crash the economy while trying to be more responsive to this pandemic? Do you have strategies that you've seen that have worked, that have allowed business to continue, but certain measures to allow coronavirus to be combated? Any thoughts there?
Well, I do think that looming out in the horizon for Americans is a big decision. As I said earlier, we had gotten down to 20,000 cases a day nationally. We then spiked up to 60,000 a day in mid-July. We're down to 40. That's still a very unacceptable level. The experts are telling us that we have to get down to 10,000 in order to be able to feel like this is that we have flattened the curve permanently to a degree in which the outbreaks that continue are manageable, and we can begin to understand where they are and the like. So we're a long way away from 40,000 to 10,000 a day. We still have 21 states in this country that are rising each day. We've seen declines in those places that were out of control recently: Texas, Arizona, Florida, California. But we're seeing very sharp advances in many states in the West and in the upper Midwest and in the South still. So what I meant by the question is, what happens if we're at 40 and we hit the winter and we're in a different situation, and with a dual outbreak of seasonal flu and this, and there's accelerated transmission, and we bounce back up to 60 or 70,000. What do we turn to in terms of an instrument? In other words, people have said, hell no, lockdown, no, it failed. Yes, we did it in a halfway measure. We lifted prematurely, but it's hard for politicians to imagine saying to Americans, we have no choice but to go back to a very tough lockdown for a strong period of time. That may be the only best decision. If we go back to 60 or 70,000 a day over a sustained basis, and we've got an out of control epidemic in more than half of this country. It doesn't mean every last state, but we haven't reached that decision point yet. And in the dialogues that Tony Fauci and others have had with people like myself, it's been this wait, let's see what we can do. And the argument up to now has been, let's insist on people taking control of their responsibility for their behavior in order to move things forward, and let's be very selective, like we see in many states, right? Bars, other congregational sites being very heavily controlled and very cautiously reopened. And let's do that, and let's urge our business sector to stay functional, but be remote for as long as they can, if that can be made to work. And we have had a transformation in American businesses in many sectors. Is remarkable how well, and our unemployment has come down to 8%, 8 or 9%. It was up to 14 at one point. And there's still massive suffering and massive unemployment, but let's hope, if under one scenario is that we have a cautious and gradual recovery, but we have to be investing at the same time in those health capacities that we neglected. There's still a gap in most jurisdictions of not having adequate testing, not having the ability to isolate, quarantine, and contact trace. And if we don't have those capacities, we won't be able, if we suppress this, you're still going to have outbreaks coming forward, even as we're distributing vaccines over the next 2 years. We have to have those basic capacities. We have to invest in those basic capacities. I don't think we need to lock down the economy tomorrow, unless we get to a situation, where in large parts of the country, it's just a wildfire out of control. And we may hit that point, but I certainly hope we don't.
So I see Raj Bharadwaj has just come on view, and that's my prompt to hand over to him to close out the session.
Dr. Bhagavan, thank you so much. I've learned a lot listening to you today, and I really appreciate it.
And my pleasure talking with you. Raj?
Thank you, Dr. Raghavan, and a huge thank you to you, Dr. Morrison. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, where I have the pleasure and privilege to serve on the board, let me say a huge thank you to you, Dr. Morrison, and thank you to all the participants for being with us, listening to the insights and perspectives. We learned a lot. For members of the World Affairs Council, we are deeply grateful for your continued support and friendship. For those who are not yet members, my plea to you is to please consider, and we look forward to welcoming you into the World Affairs Council family as members. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day, evening, or night, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.